Good morning, Dr. Linda Klumpers. Thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for having me here. Oh, what are you showing me?
Yeah, a little tea time action. What have you got this morning?
We've got oolong in here from Taiwan. And what about you?
Very fancy. I am drinking some honey lemon ginger cayenne tea, to keep my throat clear for you.
Spicy stuff.
It is very spicy, and I will tell you that my face, I have this rash and it's really itchy, so I have doubled down on my CBD intake, and if I stay casually baked, I don't think about it as much, so I am medicated this morning.
With lots of stuff and tea. Well, I'm sorry to hear about that rash. I hope you're able to not scratch too much, not touch it.
Yeah, but I'm serious. The cannabis totally does help me take my mind off of the itching. But yes, just warning you, because I know you like to. We stick to the science with you, so I just got to tell you, I'm a little bit baked this morning.
Okay, well, let's see how that goes. Maybe
right.
The questions will be very original, but I think it's if that is what keeps you off your mind off the rash, I think that's a good thing. I used to have severe eczema as a child, and as a baby, my mom would sew my sleeves tight so I couldn't scratch myself. So that's one way.
I could
Yeah.
put mittens on. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
So I'm really glad that you're here to talk to me today. I was messaging one of my friends on LinkedIn, and he played college football when I played basketball at Midwestern. And he asked if I had done a show on CTE and brain injuries. And I was just like, no, but I know exactly who to reach out to. So, I started doing a little bit of homework. I watched some documentaries, and I didn't really ever think about it, but they talked about brain injuries as an invisible disability. And the more stuff that I watched, I was just like, wow, it's so true. You can't see it. And then someone can tell you, like, hey, I have a brain injury. And, there's always this questioning from either an employer that you're making something up or whatever, because you can't see it. So I wanted to really shed some light on just the plight of people with brain injuries, but then also find out from you any current research that's going on around cannabis use and cannabinoid therapy, and what people can do to try to kind of bring some normalcy back to their life.
Yeah. And I think you described it really well, that it's so invisible. All the materials you watched, have you by any chance also seen the film Concussion?
I haven't yet, but it was one of the ones that was on the list.
Yeah, definitely. It's a really good one. And there you see what is really interesting. If you start diving deeper into it, you probably know very well. There are a lot of things we don't know. There are a lot of things we know. And what is also difficult to see is that things are not always about the facts, not always about what you find, the research, but also for a large part about politics. And the reason why I'm saying this is that I don't want to be political in any sense, but we should keep that in mind. Also, when we talk about the question, what do we know about cannabis and brain injuries? And why is there also a lot that we don't know about these two things? So, well, I think I hope we have enough time during this podcast to cover all of this.
We have as much time as we want. I'm in charge.
Look at that.
Whether or not you got to get out of here or not. So where should we dive in? I mean, I guess I want to start with the fact that brain injuries happen all the time, anywhere. It can be, car accidents, organized sports, contact sports. People suffer brain injuries that have, blue collar jobs and have accidents at work, or, there's strokes and aneurysms and different diseases. So, brain injury can affect anyone in any family at any time. And the thing that I thought was so peculiar is that it's really hard to detect. And so I'm curious from your perspective, what that's like as far as, how doctors go about, how scientists go about detecting brain injury.
Yeah. Well, so brain injury often happens on a really low level in the brain, so really on the cellular level. And there are some things you can see from the outside. So if you were talking about an aneurysm, you're talking about a stroke, for example. And if you're talking about those situations from blood vessels that break, for example, you typically can see that with imaging techniques. For a lot of injuries to the brain, that is not the case. So another form of brain injury is, for example, caused by several types of dementia. You can say that my, insert family member suffers from Alzheimer's disease, but the real diagnosis often is made after death. And the same happens for a lot of the brain injuries too. There are various types of brain injuries. Before we got on this podcast, you already said it's from this LinkedIn message, was someone specifically asking about CTE. So that is a chronic traumatic brain, encephalopathy. So the chronic aspect in there, chronic means that it happened over a longer period of time. So this is repeated brain injuries that eventually led to the CTE. And then there's other terms that you hear about sometimes and that you read in context of sports. Very often, but also in accidents. It's TBI. That's the traumatic brain injury. So caused by trauma. So caused from the outside by the trauma on the head. And a repetition of these cases of TBI can lead to CTE. So there you have various ways that you can get brain damage, and there's also different stages of these types of brain damage. And for CTE, you also have different classifications of how bad the injury actually is. And no, these are injuries that happen on a really small level in the brain. And at this point, there's active research going on in how are we able to detect these injuries without having to take brain tissue from these people, but by, for example, combining various imaging types into one diagnostic tool. But that research is still ongoing, and hopefully we will hear more about that in the coming time. But for now, it's very hard. It's more symptoms that you try to add up and then try and draw a conclusion about what is possibly going wrong with these people.
Yeah, and when you're talking about the trauma occurring over, a long period of time, an example that I saw was, put a peach in a box and just rattle the box back and forth, and then take it out and look what's happened to the peach. And it's like the human brain is more soft and malleable than that peach. And so that was like, okay, got it. And so there's a lot of the frontal lobe damage, and then the back of the head for, like football players who are constantly just like pounding their heads into each other. So then, there's all these personality changes and stuff end up being what these symptoms are. Like, you're constantly seeing on the news some football player that's beat the hell out of his girlfriend in an elevator or killed somebody. And you're just like, how is that possible? You have all this money, you have all this fame or whatever, but it's like, yeah, and you also have brain damage.
Absolutely. They kill others, they kill themselves. So maybe that's a good point, because I'm not sure who is listening. I'm not sure what these people know about these types of brain injuries and what the consequences are, how they display themselves, why they're so important. It has been in the news a lot, of course, so people might have read about it. But yeah, for the people who don't know, maybe it's good to talk about these symptoms a little bit and then see how that relates to the brain damage that you see, because you're already talking about the frontal lobe. which is, of course, a very important area. That's where a lot of our personality is housed, where we make decisions, certain decisions. And indeed, aggression, suicidality, and even particular diseases that you would actually expect in someone who lived a few decades longer than these younger people. Right?
Having the memory loss is another one. And the way I was taught about the frontal lobe is like it's our central processing unit of our brains. And so to me, that makes a lot of sense. Like if there's damage there, then everything you do, every decision you make is going to be a little skewed or off, or, your wires have been crossed, so to speak.
Yeah. Have you ever come across, this is maybe, this is a parallel I'm drawing, but have you ever heard about the case of a patient called Phineas Gage?
No.
So that was actually how people discovered what happened in the frontal lobe. This man was a good family guy, and he worked in building train tracks. And then one time he had a pole in his hand and was, let's say, I'm not sure how you call that, but trying to put explosives. And then things went wrong. The explosives exploded, and the pole went straight through his frontal part of the brain. And after that, his personality changed entirely. And that helped a lot in the understanding of what the frontal lobe actually does. It really does change your personality. He became aggressive, he started gambling, and he was aggressive to his wife. So, and that is also part of what you see happening with people with these brain injuries, and also post-mortem. If you look at the brains and you look at where the injuries are for the most part, and the injuries that we are talking about in this case are, for example, little molecules, let's say, that called tangles, that occupy these cells and that make them dysfunctional. And a lot of them are found in the frontal lobe. And also a lot of them are found in other brain areas where you actually would expect them to be, because they are disturbing that behavior. So emotional processing is also damaged. And you see a lot of these tangles also in a particular brain area called the amygdala, where there are a lot of our basic emotions are there in the amygdala.
Is that here?
It's not at the far back. That is more for your coordination. That's your cerebellum. It's more like in the middle, somewhere. But it's deep in the brain, and yet there's damage there.
So, all of these things, I was watching one of the documentaries and it started talking to family members. And so you just think, like, I'm married to this person, and then all of a sudden they come home and they're a completely different person. So, these sorts of things affect everyone in a family. So if we're trying to figure out, okay, does cannabis have a place in helping these people with treatment of it, or perhaps even slowing the onset of it? What research have you done, or what findings have you had as cannabis correlates to CTE and other brain injuries?
Yeah, that's a very, very hard question. And it is also really difficult to find people who have a lot of experience with this. So there are a few things that we can share. So in the first place, there are anecdotal stories. So there are people who say, well, I use these cannabis products, and those can be various cannabis products. Most lately, recently we have mainly been hearing about the cannabinoid cannabidiol being protective for these people or helping these people with their symptoms. So that's one thing.
And let's interject real quick that the federal government has a patent on cannabidiol for being a neuroprotectant. So there's no arguing that. I mean, they tell us we can't say these things, but they've filed a patent on it. So clearly it must be true.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I know this researcher who filed this patent, who's an excellent researcher. And the various cannabinoids have various neuroprotective effects. Does it mean that if you use cannabis, your brain is automatically protected? That's, of course, the question. And cannabis is not, one cannabis is not the other cannabis. So there are a lot of nuances there. But then, you cannot really do a study and give people cannabis and then let them damage their brain and see what happens. So what you actually want to do is do studies in humans who have the risk of getting these brain injuries and then see what happens. And a research friend of mine, Dr. Ryan Van Dry at Johns Hopkins, has actually tried to set up a study like this, contacting the NFL and seeing if they can do a study with CBD. But I do not know the details about this, but I can tell you it's been years and there's still not such a study.
Interesting.
Right? It seems like the NFL has backed out for...
Yes, they backed out because 99% of autopsied NFL players have CTE.
That's correct. So you're probably referring to a study from 2017. So what happened, just from a historic perspective, in 2015, there was a publication by this Nigerian, now American doctor, Omalu, who found that in one NFL player that he did an autopsy on, that he found an image of the brain when he put that under the microscope that he has never seen before. It looked like a case of CTE, of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And after that, in 2017, a whole range of more than 200 donated brains, were investigated by another group. And they categorized these brains on how severely they were damaged, but also on which level these were all football players, on which level these players were playing. Among those brains, there were 111, I believe, brains from NFL players, so professional, highest level, and with really severe pathology before their death. So symptoms were pretty bad. And then after looking at these 111 brains, 110 of those showed CTE. So
I love that I can just throw something out willy-nilly because I didn't write down where it came from, and that you can just follow up and tell everybody the story. Thank you. That's why I love you so much, Linda.
It's good to do this together. Great.
Good tag team.
So back to the science. You want to do this study. There is no such study. By the way, the researcher I mentioned is not the only one who was involved in potential NFL studies. There are also, of course, people who are not current NFL players anymore who are still interested in participating in these studies. And some groups try to set up studies with them, which is logistically sometimes not that easy. I've actually been part of trying to set up such a study myself for a client, but then that did not follow through. So it's really unfortunate. There are actually not really any studies that have been going on. I actually, before this podcast, I looked on the clinical trials website where American clinical trials mostly are registered. And there's one that is planned on happening, not in CTE, but in TBI, so traumatic brain injury. And yeah, they haven't started recruiting yet. It's a study with traumatic brain injury and cannabidiol. So let's see if that will happen. That would be interesting. But yeah,
Did it say when it was set to start? Does it give those sorts of details?
sometimes they give these details, but most often you cannot count on them. So what I would suggest then is to look at a website like that, and I can give you the link later, and that people can then look at the research side itself, because another study that was given there that would look at CBD and traumatic brain injury was withdrawn because of lack of sponsor money. So that's another issue, and that was also an issue with my client at the time. Changing investors, changing direction, and then unfortunately, super interesting research will never happen. And that's
Well, I know some people. I may have to connect you with somebody that can help with that. More on that later. Let's talk about that offline. So,
yeah.
Okay. So now we don't have a bunch of studies, but we have a lot of people with anecdotal evidence. My friend particularly said, I have fewer side effects if I use cannabis than if I use the pharmaceutical drugs for it. And, helping with the mood and helping with the headaches. And so, from the information you have access to through Cannify, do you have any information on cannabis and treating those symptoms?
People do use cannabis for those type of symptoms. With Cannify, we try to not stay too medical, so we're not diagnosing people. We're not trying to ask too much about a medical history. So there are some gaps there, but definitely it is a matter of symptom management. But as you asked before, you said, is this really symptom management? Is there something you can try and delay the onset of the effects? Things like that. And those are very interesting questions to ask as well. And I think in that light, it's also interesting to mention that there has been a study looking at the outcomes of people with traumatic brain injury and whether they had a positive THC screen. And people with a positive THC screen from the 3-year study showed better outcomes after they did suffer traumatic brain injury. So suggesting kind of a protective or preventative effect almost.
That makes sense because, that's what we find with the Alzheimer's research. Because, earlier you said, a lot of those things can go hand in hand. Alzheimer's is brain trauma, I guess. And so, there's someone in Sonoma County, a doctor who's been doing cannabis research with Alzheimer's patients for, I believe, over 10 years. So you would think that yes, I don't know. I would recommend people to completely experiment with cannabis for brain injury, but I think a lot of it is the ingesting of it versus just the smoking of it.
Yeah, I do not know too much about that because, for example, that study, the preventative study, really looked at does someone have a positive THC screen or not? So there already we know the compound THC, we're not talking about CBD here, but how that THC got in the body, we don't know. So there's a lot of information missing, and it would be super interesting to do a survey on this. For Alzheimer's, there are various aspects because, of course, you have the pathology and then you have the symptoms. And outcomes with Alzheimer's patients and cannabinoids have been a bit mixed. So some studies claim that cannabinoids can decrease the aggression level in Alzheimer's patients. Other studies cannot find that. And that's also, again, to show that it's really when people conduct a study with cannabinoids, it is so important to give the right product, with the right compounds, the right dose, the right administration form. And that is something that is easily overlooked in many of these studies.
Well, that's interesting that you say that because we're all precious snowflakes and all of our sweet spot, and that dose is different for all of us. So if it is a study and everybody's getting 50 milligrams or 25 milligrams, and one of them weighs 100 pounds and one weighs 245 pounds, we're already screwed.
Yeah. No, very good point. Very good point. That is also a point of criticism on many trials as well. Where do you go? Because you can give everyone the same dose, but you can also desire a particular response level and follow a titration protocol, meaning that you start with this dose, and then if it's not sufficient, you go on and on and on until you get the effect you need. Or until you have side effects that makes it not tolerable anymore. And that is the case with, for example, that's a real example of how the drug Epidiolex is given to epileptic patients. So Epidiolex is the CBD drug, a pharmaceutical compound for epilepsy treatment. And you don't just give a child 25 milligrams per kilogram per day. No, you start off with a lower dose and then you go slowly up and see what happens.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point for anybody who is experimenting with cannabis or they've been using cannabis for any sort of, brain trauma is, if I have anxiety and I use the wrong strain, or I maybe, smoke too much or eat too big of an edible, it can amplify those symptoms. And same for when I have a headache. So, your pain response and that, I don't know, irritability, aggressiveness, anxiousness, all those sorts of things. If you go too far over the edge, you're back where you started, and even amplified. And so it really behooves you to, keep a journal, write down what you took, how you were feeling, how you felt 10, 15 minutes later, so you can find out, pretty clearly what products and what methods of consumption give you the most relief.
Yeah, and that is exactly also why it's so important to use products that are trustworthy. Exactly for that reason. Dose is so important. As you say, symptoms can be treated. Symptoms can also be amplified. A lot of these compounds, and THC and CBD are not an exception, give so-called biphasic effects. Some people call it a U-shaped curve effect, whereby indeed you can have very beneficial effects in one dose, but the opposite can be true for a lower or higher dose. So it's a very important point to make.
Now, is there anything else we need to touch on in this regard? Because there's a couple of other parts of the brain I would like to discuss with you.
Oh, okay. Now you're making me curious.
Well, I have a lot of littles, and, people get their kids involved in sports at such an early age. And so I wanted to talk to you about the developing brain of a child playing contact sports.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. So maybe we should start with indeed that the developing brain is very different from the adult brain. And you can see in, for example, concussions. If you get a concussion as an adult, it will take typically more than a week, like 7 to 10 days. But it's different for everyone for it to get better, for you to get better, feel better, although the real symptoms can last much longer. For a child, it takes much longer, a young child. The developing brain, can the consequences of damaging anything can be so much more severe than when you are already full grown and developed. So it's good that you're bringing it up. Yeah,
you see, I'm waiting for the big but.
Well, there's, it's maybe I'm going to say things that people don't want to hear, and I don't want
that all the time.
Oh, really? Okay, I don't want people to not listen to your podcast anymore because of this. But contact sports. There you go, and there are. But there's differences between contact sports and contact sports. I mean, and it's really a matter of what you're used to. But I'm an outsider in many ways. I'm not from the United States originally, and also I'm not a big sporter myself. I don't really do sports. There are a lot of things. I like moving around. I like hiking and dancing and whatnot. But I'm not a big sports person. And so I'm looking at these things sometimes and wondering, what is happening? Why do people do this? I have friends doing all kinds of fighting sports. I actually come from a family with boxers. But I'm looking at it and I think, why would you want to punch someone in the face? I just don't get. But it's a personal thing, right? But even as that, and if you're all into this, then it's so normal. And of course you're doing it. Of course your children are gonna do it. Of course it is exciting. Of course we're sitting all on the couch and watch this TV show where people, yeah, beat each other, to say it in a nice way. But from a scientific perspective or a distant perspective or a healthcare perspective, you see something that is happening where people voluntarily, they opt in to get neurological damage, because that is the consequence of a punch, that you know that is going to be neurological damage. And when I first came to the States and actually realized how big American football is, and I looked at it and I saw a field with people with helmets and all kinds of protection, I thought, what's going on here? If that is the protection you need, why are you doing it in the first place? But okay, people do it anyway. But I wanted to give that perspective, because if this is your world, it's so normal. And I just want to say that outside of that world, there are countries where these type of fighting sports, I don't even know the name of those, they're forbidden. It's not allowed in certain countries to have these type of sports that damage people's brains.
Yeah, and here you get this, the brain damage for free, so to speak, unless you become a professional athlete, and then they pay you to get the brain damage.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, if we're talking about little children, I mean, there are a lot of fun activities that I think are safer. So just indeed, treatment is one thing. If you can prevent it, please do so. Prevention is everything. Prevent those brains, because if you have a cut in your hand, it can easily heal. If anything damages in your brains, it will just not grow back. And yeah, don't damage your brains. Please, people, don't.
So the tissue, yes, once you've damaged brain tissue, it just dies and is just there. Tell me what that looks like.
Yeah, that also really depends on the type of brain damage you have. So what can happen is that inside the cells you can get all kinds of damage. You can have a loss of cell number, loss of cell volume, and loss of cell volume is something you really, really notice. You can also see that in the CTE patients, that there are some holes in the brains, and that those only get bigger. So there's all types of damage possible that you can't see from the outside. Everything stiffens up.
Well, and another thing that I think about regarding children playing, contact sports, playing, this peewee football. And I mean, my nephew looked so cute with that big helmet on and those pads, but then I start seeing him and these little kids smashing each other. And I was just like, sister, I think this is a little too soon, but they love it. And so these, this stuff is happening, but then you also have all of these like angsty teenagers or, that have these anger management issues or whatever. And you don't know whether or not it's a personality thing or if they've suffered head trauma or, because again, the detection, it's not adequately identified. And what I had read was that you really can't even detect this sort of thing until, a post-mortem review autopsy of the body. So yeah.
It's really, really tough. And another thing that I noticed, you say this little child and then it has a helmet on and so on. A lot of people also get bolder because they feel safer when they wear it. So I've worked in a radioactive lab before, and then you only get one glove. Because if you have 2 gloves, you might just not be as safe as you when you have 1 glove, because you really don't want the other hand to get exposed or touch something. And that's with a lot of chemicals that you don't want to touch. You just get 1 glove for your experiments. And that is to not make you feel safer and do unsafe things as a consequence. And that might happen also with this protection. Maybe you have your helmet and you, I don't know, touch someone, hit someone harder. But it's a whole different matter that I'm talking about. I realize that. But yeah, all I can say is we need to do much more research, but please prevent it.
Well, and right now, with everybody being virtually educated, we need our kids to have more brain activity. So, like, let's start like putting them in chess club or something. I'm like, do something different. But I had read that 20% of brain injuries are related to the organized sports. So, that's a significant number.
Yeah, it's a significant number, and it's something you can prevent more easily. I mean, you cannot just prevent cancer necessarily, or diabetes necessarily. Of course, there are a lot of lifestyle choices as well. This is a lifestyle choice, right? You don't have to play sports. I mean, not that type of sports. There are many different types of sports.
Yeah. When you get older, nerds are cool. Nerds get the chicks, okay? So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, but it's. I think it's really important to keep someone's tradition, etc., etc. But yeah, I hope that people are very. Also, a lot of people just didn't know. For decades, they didn't know. This Dr. Omalu was. The NFL tried to silence him. They tried to reject his or retract his publication. So people also didn't know. So I hope everyone gets educated on this so that they can make better decisions.
Yeah, well, we're trying to help. And another statistic that was very interesting and speaks volumes is that 80% of the prison population has brain injuries.
Wow, I didn't even know that statistic.
So, personality changes, socioeconomic situations, like all of these things compound. And, that's, again, I care about this stuff. I met someone during the COVID lockdown last year, and he had spent 35 years in California State Prison, and it was his first year out in the world. And he's a drug and alcohol counselor now. And we kept meeting each other in the same park. And so I just struck up a conversation with him one day, and he told me what he did. And I told him I had a podcast. And so I encouraged him to listen. And then we just kept seeing each other. And so I've asked him a ton of questions about life in the prison system and the services they have available to them. And he went through, several different programs to help him get off of drugs and alcohol and just kind of get himself back on a path of growth and recovery. And, I don't know what kind of programs are available for people with brain injuries, but, from the stuff that I've seen, like, things just need to be really slowed down and, broken down into baby steps. And I feel like, yes, cannabis is a great help, but obviously we can't shovel, cannabis into the prison system. That's being done illegally anyway. But, being able to provide services for people with brain injuries and, doing some of these studies within our prison system. We can talk about that offline too, because I would love to get something like that going.
Yeah, that's so important. And sorry, it broke up for me a little bit. I might have lost the internet, but I think that more studies are needed. Definitely, I hope that organizations are not stopping that from happening if there's not a good scientific reason to not do so. And 80% of people in prison with brain injury, there are not many countries working this way, but many people are in prison and have some psychiatric disorder and just need treatment. They might not even, maybe shouldn't be in prison. They just need mental help. And especially to get them out and to get them back in society again, these mental health programs are so important. And I hope that will improve in the coming time to give people the help that they need so that they can hopefully fully function again, and the pharmacological treatments they need if needed.
Absolutely. So is there anything that I didn't ask you or that we didn't cover that's relevant to the conversation?
Well, I am not so sure, but I think that watching that film, I think would be really nice to see Concussion with Will Smith from 2015.
All right. I'll put it on my list for tonight.
Good.
Now I'm going to look, make sure I didn't miss anything else on my notes, and look through the comments, see if there's anybody that has a question for you.
Okay. Oh, there are.
This one guy says that edibles help him more than his prescription medicine, which, you know, based on what my friends have told me, I absolutely believe that. And, you know, what are some of these drugs that are the pharmaceutical drugs that are given? Like, what are those side effects that, you know, people are opting to choose cannabis over?
Yeah, I'm actually curious to hear what the prescription medicine was, right?
Yeah. Well, I didn't know if you knew what some of these drugs were that people are given.
Yeah. It really depends on the symptom because it's all symptom management, but it's typically to calm people down in their behavior or to make them less anxious. Those kind of drugs.
So an antipsychotic or an antidepressant or something?
Antidepressant, anti-anxiety, and these drugs, yeah, they have sometimes nasty side effects related to sometimes to weight management or many gastrointestinal disorders actually.
So, you know, I freely give my advice all the time on how I think people can consume cannabis. But do you have any sort of advice that you would give someone who's wanting to cautiously, you know, start out and see if they can choose cannabis as a solution?
Yeah, I think it's very important in the first place to always do that with your healthcare provider, because there are many reasons why you would want to do that. So as this person AG already said, it helps more than prescription medicine. Some people might be taking their cannabinoids together with other drugs. And in that case, there could be an issue of a drug interaction that you want to avoid. So make sure you discuss this with your healthcare provider, be it your GP, be it your specialist or pharmacist. That is a very important step. Furthermore, also, you might be at risk to, just as you said, because of your pathology, you might be at risk to actually enhance certain effects that you don't want to. They can make you, it can give you psychotic type symptoms. They can make you feel panicked, for example, and you want to avoid that at all costs. So doing it together with the healthcare provider is very important. Dose regulation too, start really low if you are not sure, especially for THC. For CBD, that's less of an issue. CBD practically does not really have side effects to worry about, typically. The only things to really worry about with CBD are the drug-drug interaction, as well as this is an issue for people who might have a liver disease. There might be some liver issues. Just make sure you discuss it with your doctor, really.
Interesting. You have one other question. Is there a noticeable difference in brain damage between people in professional contact sports that use cannabis or cannabis-like products and people that don't?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. That's exactly the study that we should do. That's what we've been talking about. We have to do this study. The issue is that, in professional contact sports, people are not allowed to use cannabis. So there was another request to the NFL to have their players use CBD because THC, let's say the compound that makes you feel high, that's out of the question. You cannot use that in any professional sports. And for CBD,
Although using THC when you're performing athletic functions, you can get in the flow and be so good. But yes, they won't let you. But it's
they
good.
won't let you. No, but yeah, a lot of people have positive experiences with that. CBD too. And for CBD, there's not really drug tests like urine screens on demand, really. But it's not allowed. And therefore, you can't really test it. But therefore, I found it so important to mention this retrospective study. So the study that looked at data that were gathered from people with traumatic brain injury that had positive THC screen, because in that group of people, it was shown that they had a lower chance to die of their traumatic brain injury when they were actually THC positive. So they were cannabis users. So there might be a protective effect, but this is all speculation. So I hope that answers your question a little bit as good as it can be.
Well, I think it's a hopeful response, and I'm going to help you get that study going. So,
deal.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for hanging out. I know there's never, a ton of information because of all of the restrictions on the studying of cannabis and other cannabinoids. So, but I think we answered some questions as good as possible today. And when we know more, we will do more.
Yeah, stay tuned. We hope to do more.
All right. Well, thank you for hanging out.
Thank you so much. It was fun.